Wonderful. So we are live on YouTube, everybody. And I think we can get started. So let me make sure. So hi, everybody. Thank you, everybody, for having us in your home or wherever you are tonight. This is a No Dumb Questions Quorum, and this is part of the Sun Prairie. This is part of the month-long Sun Prairie Plan to Restore the Right to Breathe, and that is a plan of a series of events where we bring some dialogues together around what's happening around our country, provide that healing space for communities that are feeling really hurt right now, and really think about how our policies and how systemic racism is built into our lives every single day. And so we have a little presentation that we're going to go through, but this is really coming guided a lot by the questions that we got from community members. So thank you so much for sending in your questions. And today I have with me Dr. Damina Brown and Dr. Brienne Pitts. And Dr. Brown does not have video, but you can hear her wonderful voice through the presentation, a brilliant voice that we have, as well as Dr. Pitts' brilliant voice. Dr. Pitts does have video. So what I'll do is I'll have Dr. Brown start off introducing herself, and let me know when you're done, and then I'll move on to Brienne Pitts. Dr. Brown.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. Let's see. I think what I would like to say is that I highly value forums like this. My work over the last few decades has been very much invested in community education, community-based education, particularly for marginalized communities. But my approach has been to look at the ways we can develop self-awareness using contemplative practice, and to use that foundation as a way to engage in community with a more creative approach to liberated narratives. So my doctoral work is in, that very thing, looking at intersectionality, looking at movements for social justice, and finding ways to interrupt dominant narratives by empowering the voices of marginalized people. And that's it for me.
Well, we're feeling so lucky to have you here with us. And I know you've been incredibly busy in lots of conversations. So thank you for taking the time.
Happy to.
Dr. Pitts, can we have you introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi. First, I want to say how well suited I feel I am for this forum, in that I, as a white woman trying to work towards anti-racist practice, ask a lot of dumb questions. So thank you so much, Ruben. Thank you, Dr. Brown, for allowing me to join you tonight for this conversation. I recently completed my doctoral work at UW Wisconsin in multicultural education and curriculum instruction. And my doctoral dissertation was on white teachers teaching Black history in K-12 schools. So I'm particularly interested in how white folks such as myself perpetuate narratives, either for pleasure or pain, for liberation or continued suppression. And I also write about critical literacies and am currently working on a project revolving Black power and working with two other scholars to assess children's literature and our narratives. So beyond that, I'm a teacher in the Sun Prairie School Districts. I am an instructional coach at Creekside Elementary. And tonight we're being joined by about 160 teachers from across the school district. So thank you for being here. And I hope to be a vulnerable participant. And I'm certain I will ask and answer some challenging questions this evening. So thank you.
Thank you for being here with us. And so my name is Ruben Sandone. I'm the Communications and Diversity Strategist for the City of Sun Prairie. Like I said, feeling so blessed to have these two brilliant people with us. I only got my bachelor's, so I will be quiet a lot of the time tonight. And we'll be mostly speaking from experience and the amazing people that I've gotten to work with and the light research that I've gotten to do about this stuff. I want to point out a couple of the reasons you've heard about their amazing backgrounds. But I think one strong thing that we're going to see from Dr. Pitts tonight, and the conversations that I've had in the last few weeks, I'm hearing from a lot of people, I don't know how to have these conversations. I don't know how to be a white ally. And we really want Dr. Pitts to be that example tonight of what we're asking for when we ask you to be that white ally. And like we said, this is going to be a conversation. This is going to be a learning process. This is the beginning of a much longer journey. And lots of people have been doing this work for a really long time. I don't want to take credit away from them, but I know a lot of people on this phone call tonight. This is the first time you're diving into this stuff. And so I'm happy to have you here. So what I'm going to do is as everybody knows, we're on Zoom. It is a different time. So we're not doing our meetings in person right now. But I'm going to start sharing my screen so that we can see our presentation. So what we're going to start out with is this first welcoming page. So tonight is all about asking those burning questions that I know a lot of people who may not have lived through constant oppression in this country may have questions about, or people who just don't have the capacity to educate themselves about where these things came from. A lot of these things are built so deep into our history that a lot of times it's hard to even know where to start. So I really appreciate everybody who's part of this tonight. So just to give you an overview of our agenda, we're gonna do some activities, so some reflective pieces, and I really value reflection and constant reflection. I think it's something you can bring into your life all the time. So we're gonna start off with thinking about a day while Black. Then we're gonna go into understanding what allyship is and how we can elevate that to co-conspiratorship and really what that means. Really naming and framing racism and white supremacy. I know those words can feel really threatening even saying them out loud. And so understanding why it's so important to actually call them what they are and how that actually gives or takes away power from those words. How systemic racism works in our society, then answering some of those questions that we got from our audience that is here tonight. And then we're going to think about how it's affecting our community. This is a Sun Prairie supported event, but I think a lot of these themes can be seen across the Madison area, with communities around it, in Madison, across Wisconsin. So this is going to be a really great thing for everybody living in this state. And then we're going to dive into what you can do next and think about, now that you know all this stuff, how can we be those co-conspirators that we're asking you to be? But we got to introduce ourselves. I just wanted to show you our faces. Dr. Demita Brown's face is right here on the screen, so I'm really happy we got that. But like I said, my name is Ruben Tanon. I'm joined here with Dr. Demita Brown and Dr. Brianne Pitts. Feeling very happy to start this conversation tonight. So what we want to do before we even dive into this is set some, not ground rules, because we're not really having a conversation between you, the audience, and ourselves, but really what we're expecting that's going to be challenging through this conversation. So one of the things we wanted to start out with is, why are we doing this right now? And you know, it's on the heels of the tragic death and murder of George Floyd, of course. And we know that these have been issues that people have been working on and need to have been working on for a really long time. And so I have a quote here that says, the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago. The second best time is right now. And thinking about how we're gonna make this progress, how we're gonna have a better future for ourselves and for our future generations, we're gonna start this work right now with ourselves. Some other things that we really want you to think about is this is going to be uncomfortable. The whole reason it's uncomfortable, I think, for allies is because people of color and Black people are feeling this pain and this anxiety in this system all the time. And a lot of times as a white person, you're being exposed to it with very purposeful energy behind it so that you understand it. And that means that you're taking on some of that pain, some of that anxiety that actually exists all the time in the community. And so thinking that if we don't talk about it, it doesn't exist, is really the opposite of what we're trying to say here. We're really trying to say, you need to talk about it because that's how we dismantle it, that's how we break it down. And really understanding that our liberation is tied up with each other. Just because you recognize somebody else's struggle, it does not negate your struggle. And we really want to understand that these systems work to hurt everybody. You know, they really bring violence and oppression to people of color, and they can be oppressive systems for everybody in our community. So I really hope that we can co-liberate together tonight and start that process. Brianne, did you want to say something?
I wanted to just comment briefly on the light versus heavy. A recent analysis that I think has been helpful is thinking about this as a workout. For us white folks, often we're not used to this fatigue that our friends and colleagues of color feel constantly. And we need to position ourselves as doing the work by leaning into that discomfort. And so I'll challenge you to say that if you're uncomfortable, if it hurts, if you get to a point in this conversation where you feel that it's too much, lean in, because that means that we're getting at something that really needs to be unearthed. And so I want to just say that I commiserate but that our pain is nowhere near that of our colleagues who suffer the oppression every day that society levies on them. And as Ruben said, our liberation is completely tied, because until we are all free, none of us are. So thank you again, and lean in, guys.
And Dr. Brown, before we hop into the conversation, is there anything that you wanted to add as ground rules or expectations of our conversation tonight?
I don't think so. I really appreciated what Dr. Pitts just said. And I'm particularly interested in how we lean in and not compare our pain.
Yeah, thank you.
Because that kind of Olympics that we can get into is also damaging. But what hurts hurts, and you don't have to justify, validate, or compare it.
Thank you so much. So let's start leading in, people. So we're going to start off with an activity that I was particularly interested in, thinking about a day while Black. I grew up in Madison, Wisconsin, and it's a very white community that I grew up in. A lot of people that I grew up around just have a really hard time understanding that pain and anxiety that comes with really normal stuff. And so on your screen right now, I just really walked through what a normal day for me kind of feels like, waking up, opening the blinds in my home, getting in the car and driving to work, especially when I'm not working from home during COVID-19. At City Hall, I walk through the back door, and the back door is partly entrance to City Hall where I work and partly entrance to the police station. I might sometimes walk to get lunch in our community of Sun Prairie. I take the county highway home because that's the fastest way to get home. Then I maybe grab something from the gas station. I pull the trash cans in at the end of the day. It was trash day, so that was really a friend of mine. And then I sit on my back porch, maybe walk the dog, and then I grab a drink of water before I go to bed. And so I think that can be a really relatable, normal day for everybody. But I really wanted to expose people who identify as allies that in every single step of my day, there is this anxiety that's associated with being a Black person in a very white space. And so I don't know if people can think about this, but when you open your blinds, you're opening up your home to the world, and you're opening up to see who you are. I think there's a lot of stories that we can see in our communities across the country where seeing someone who's not white in a white community inside of a house has been mistaken as somebody intruding into a house over and over again. And so even at the beginning of my day, I have that anxiety about, is somebody looking at me like I am a threatening person in my own home? Because even though I can make relationships with my neighbors and have people around me that feel like they know who I am, there's so much power in that whiteness, even if they're driving by the house, to say something seems untoward in the house that I have deemed doesn't belong to this person. And I really want to talk about how that starts right when we wake up. Then driving to work, we all have heard about driving while Black and the anxiety that can come with, am I driving the perfect way? I can still be pulled over even if I'm not driving perfectly. What can happen? We have stories about people who have been pulled out of their cars by officers and it just leading down really dark paths. And so that anxiety runs through your head while you're driving to work. Walking through the back door, like I said, I walk past officers when I go into my building. And while the officers have been amazingly kind and welcoming while I'm there, that relationship between police enforcement and the Black community we know is a tense one. And so, I have to trust that people know who I am. I make sure my badge is visible. People know where I'm going. And again, that anxiety is built into the way that I move. Walking to get lunch, I've heard of stories, people walking down the street, and this is not just around a race, but somebody driving by has so much power to call out a name to you or to say something to you. And all you are is isolated in that moment, walking down the street. And again, you're powerless because you're surrounded by a community that doesn't look like you. Who do you turn to? Who says this is wrong? And a lot of times people are silent in those situations. Then I talk about driving home. So I drive on a county highway home, and in cities, I feel a lot more comfortable because I know that if the police are called, especially in Sun Prairie, I know a lot of them right now. Luckily, I'm a rare person that gets to know the people that do law enforcement in our community. And I think we just had somebody join us. Dr. Brown, did you have somebody join us right now?
Yes, I joined you
on the phone.
Okay, great. Wonderful. And who could I ask is joining us?
This is Dr. Brown on the phone.
Oh, okay. Apologies. Great. Never mind. So thinking about that, even going home in a different community And if my car broke down or my tire went flat, where do I go? Who do I talk to? Do I have service out here? Then I think about pulling those trash cans at the end of the day. And again, that's, I have to feel this dominance over my home and really show that I live there, because we have no idea who's driving by and who's going to think that they have the right to say that I don't live there. I think similar things can be said about sitting on my back porch, walking around my neighborhood with a dog, and then thinking about when I turn out the lights at the end of the day, and I'm walking around my home, no lights on, about to walk upstairs with a glass of water, who's seeing a Black man walking around a house with all the lights off, and what are the assumptions that are coming with that? And so I really want people to start thinking about what does it mean that all of these anxieties are happening on a regular basis. We already know that this is terrible for our health. A lot of that feeds into premature deaths for especially men, but also women in the Black community. And we also know that, these are very warranted feelings. And especially when we see or have conversations with people of color that say, that situation felt really uncomfortable for me, and I think it was about race. It may not have been in that moment, but because of that constant anxiety, you have to recognize that we're living in that all the time. And when we say something is about race, that's the way we're experiencing it, and that makes it that reality. So Dr. Brown, I didn't know if you had anything that you wanted to add to that, or if you think that's an exercise that allies can dive into.
No, I think that's brilliant. I really appreciate you going through your day that way. It really breaks it down to the moment by moment level of activity that's going on in our brains when we navigate our day, and there's a tremendous amount of stress and anxiety. And what it reminds me of is how much growing up, I used to hear adults or even just other folks at my age talk about feeling paranoid, and it was always looked at as kind of a healthy paranoia, but without minimizing that experience at all, I think it's important to look at the impact of that constant strain on our mental health.
Exactly. And
the fact that we also are dealing with a lot of trauma because of some really direct impacts of racism. And so there's, a spectrum of, issues that we have to deal with. And I think sanity is not taken for granted,
Yes.
In that respect. And I'm happy that we're starting to talk more about the impact of racism and white supremacist culture on our mental health.
Yeah, I know in our conversation that you were part of for Juneteenth last week, Judge Everett Mitchell mentioned, his own health battles that he was having, and how his doctor said, well, you've been stressed your whole life. No matter how healthy you've been, diabetes is a higher threat. High blood pressure is a higher threat for our Black communities because of that stress that you're always feeling. Dr. Pitts, when you hear that, as somebody who works to be, a co-conspirator, I know your aim is to be an abolitionist. How does that exercise kind of fit into your life?
It causes me great pause and just consideration. I think what really hit me, Ruben, when you were talking about carrying a glass of water to bed, as we saw with Breonna Taylor a few weeks ago, you can't be Black in your own bed and be safe. And as an anxious person, I think many of my teaching colleagues are. We carry a lot of empathy and anxiety along with us. I can't imagine the additional stress of being Black in the United States. And so I'm grateful for that perspective. And I look forward to continue talking this evening about some of these disparities and showcasing some of the ways that we might be able to push and help to advocate, to go beyond allyship, and to really go for abolition of some of these practices that make it dangerous to just be Black. So thank you.
So that's something I think is a really simple exercise for people to start bringing into their lives is, how am I, and the assumptions or the movements that I do and that I make of other people, how are those actually violence against other people? And how am I so lucky to not have to think about the movements and the impressions I'm giving people on a regular basis if you identify as an ally. And if you are one of the people that lives in this way every single day, thinking about how much it's impacting you and how much you learned to absorb it as part of your daily life. So I really wanted to start off with that. So I've been mentioning a couple of terms, ally and co-conspiratorship. And we really want to elevate our conversation about being an ally to being a co-conspirator. And I know that Dr. Pitts is really well-spoken on what that means. And I'm not sure, I don't think this is actually the last slide on this. I think this is actually the entrance into this, but we really want you to start thinking about, an ally is somebody who, is going to be rah, rah, rah behind you, but we really need somebody on our team. And when someone's on your team, they are running down that field with you, right? They have the skin in the game. They are making sure that the consequences of that outcome of that game that they're playing are consequences for them as well. And so I know that can be a really scary moment because privilege and white supremacy works to isolate you and separate you and protect you from the consequences of the stuff that we're talking about tonight. But we really need you to come into the conversation as a co-conspirator. And so, ally is defined as to unite or form a connection or relation between two things, to form or enter into an alliance. But really, we need a fellow conspirator because this work is so ongoing, it is so systemic, it is driven in policy, it is driven in everyday life that we need somebody working with us. And so, Dr. Pitts, would you want to talk us through kind of this, what we see on the screen right now?
Absolutely. And thank you, Ruben. So allies, I think that that's something that for many years, many of us have aspired to be. But in this current moment, in the wake of George Floyd's death, on the heels of COVID and in between it, with all of the social unrest that's currently happening, we have a lot of performative allyship. And I want to credit, it's Siruthka Chala, and she has an Instagram account that she created a number of these different images that are gorgeous. So I suggest you go visit them. But she talked about performative allyship being more around the optics. I make the Facebook posts. I show up and take pictures at a march. I post my support, but when it gets hard, I retreat. And authentic allyship, by her definition, would be not only the empathy and the grief and the outrage, but educating myself to a point that although I understand that my fight is nowhere near and nowhere as complex as that of my colleagues, I am using my example, using my privilege to actively fight against racist policies, procedures, and oppression. And if you'll go to the next slide, Ruben, a really phenomenal advocate for such practices, and you may have seen this, we won't play the video right now, but we can share these slides with you after, is Dr. Bettina Love. And Dr. Bettina Love wrote this book, We Want to Do More Than Survive, Abolitionist Teaching in the Pursuit of Educational Freedom. And she says, we have plenty of allies. We don't need any more allies. We need people to get their skin in the game. And so she talks about the relationship between Bree Newsome, who's shown in this picture here. And this is 4 or 5 years ago. And Bree Newsome went outside of the Capitol building and took down the Confederate flag. Bree Newsome learned to scale a flagpole. Bree Newsome learned to climb. She knew that she was going to be arrested. And James, and of course I've written his name down and forgotten it, but James is his first name, is this white man standing here in burnt yellow. And he used his white privilege to co-conspire with Bree Newsome, to stand there to protect her, to put his body in between hers and the police officers when they started threatening to tase her on that pole, to electrocute this woman who was doing an act of civil disobedience, not harming anyone, but making a point. And so James reached out and put his hand on the pole and like loudly stated, and this video shows, but what Dr. Love talks about is that we need that type of co-conspirator. We must align ourselves, push ourselves to the point of discomfort, and to stand with our Black friends, our colleagues, our family members, and to speak up and out at all opportunities. And this is a struggle for everyone. I can't say that I am an ally in all days. I am still a racist sometimes, because this is not a clear line for us ladies and gentlemen. And I was raised in a wonderful, loving, colorblind household because that is what we were taught to be. And so undoing these years of white supremacist ideologies is brick by brick. And moving from that performative allyship into harm's way or putting yourself on the line for colleagues and friends of color is significant. There's one more slide in this, Ruben, if you don't mind. So what Dr. Love also tells us to do is that we can't wait for someone else to take this step for us. White folks, we can't wait for a leader of white folks to come around and tell us what to do next in our classrooms, in our communities, with our friends and our families. We have to become that leader, because once we claim that we oppose oppression, this is a quote by Assata Shakur, we can't then blind our eyes to it. So this is an ongoing process, and it's by no means clean. And my explanation of it was terribly subpar. Go watch Dr. Brown. Go see, Bettina Love. Go see these doctors and philosophers and thinkers and the incredible Black literary giants who are out there telling us their story, and we've failed to listen. So I'll be quiet now.
And before I ask Dr. Brown to follow up, and because I really think, Dr. Brown, your perspective working with the Town Bank and, working in a very white community and working with connecting white communities a lot of times to communities of color through volunteerism. I'd really love to hear your perspective on allyship and elevating that to co-conspiratorship. But before I ask you that, one really strong thing that you said in there was he put his hand on the pole. And I think people mistake what co-conspiratorship is in that they think we just need more numbers, right? We just need somebody else there. But you have to understand the power that comes with whiteness in this country. The reason he put his hand on that pole is because he knew they would not dare taser him, because the way that they see him, whether they're willing to admit it or not, was as more human than somebody that they were willing to tase off of that pole. You've seen amazing examples of, I can't remember exactly where it was, but in a courtroom, I believe there was a law that they were discussing, and a group of Black protesters came in, and officers started swarming in, and then white folks started to surround them because they knew the power of that they would not be handled and beaten or arrested the same way that the Black folks that they were trying to be co-conspirators with were. And I love that photo. If we go back to this, because you don't even know who he is. And talking about that performative allyship, a lot of times people center themselves when they talk about being an ally. And really all it is putting that power that you have that comes with that whiteness behind the messages and the amazing work that leaders of color are doing.
And I want to,
go ahead.
James Tyson is the gentleman's name. And super quickly, Dr. Love, in many of her online addresses, if you Google her and you watch any of her work, she talks about our whiteness as like a cash card that just keeps giving, right? Like he can show up and use his whiteness and get directly out of jail. He can blend back in to the white masses. He can be a co-conspirator one moment and turn back and become a white ally or blend back in. So our whiteness is power, is privilege, and we must use it. So I'm sorry, and it's James Thomas. James.
Oh, that's great. And that reminds me of recently I was on my back porch and the wind slammed my back door open and I was locked out of my house. I had locked the windows and everything, except there was one window on the side of my house that goes to my kitchen that was unlocked. And I had a white friend come over and open that window and crawl inside my house because I knew that there was a lot more danger for me to be seen as some Black guy crawling through the window into my house. And even if the police had approached my house very calmly, that's still a very scary situation to be in. So it's kind of like a superpower at some points, and I think a lot of times people who are seen as allies, white folks who are trying to be allies, think of themselves as this norm. And I really do think that the systems in this country, white systemic oppression and systemic white supremacy, are built so that really there's a lot of power to oppress, and whiteness protects you from that oppression. It's not that, everybody's treated this way and Black people and brown people are treated subpar with under the rules. A lot of times these rules are built so that oppression is okay and that certain people are criminalized. And so really understanding that I think is important. So going back to what I asked you, Dr. Brown, earlier, I'd love to hear your perspective about being in a really strong volunteer space in a really white community, and how have you seen that evolution from allyship to co-conspiratorship?
Yeah, absolutely. We started out, the beginning of my tenure here was, I began working over there in October, and we created a community lab for intentional practice. The lab uses Dr. Bettina Love's book as one of its guides. And also, I think you guys know Dr. Love was here for the Racial Justice Summit that the Y did. And she also did presentations for all the teachers in the Madison Municipal School District. So I don't know if the teachers on this call are from Madison or Sun Prairie, but are they from Madison or Sun Prairie?
Mostly Sun Prairie.
Okay. I'm not sure if they also got to work with Dr. Love, but I'm so appreciative of her work, particularly because the way she talks about identity and unpacking whiteness, dismantling whiteness, is a really important part of relating to that privilege and deconstructing that privilege. Some people use the term weaponizing that privilege. I prefer just, dismantling it in a sense that you are using it in the service of what you believe. So that hand on the pole was that exact action, and but that's a really important part of the work that I think I'm encouraging. Time Bank has a large white base, and that's changing. However, we're working with that. And so encouraging people to really think about how historically white identity is wrapped in privilege, and how systemically that privilege is validated and perpetuated. So a lot of times, we go back to some of the earliest instances where we know how that relationship between personal privilege and institutional power come about. We can talk about slavery, we can talk about colonization, we can talk about genocide, we can talk about so many historical moments that involve the dehumanization of Black and brown people. And it's important to think about this, not just for the sake of history, but to gain that education that Dr. Pitts was talking about earlier. Because identity that is constructed on that historical foundation has to be examined in a way that allows us to let it go. You can be white in this culture without the white supremacist narrative. But you can't do that without actually looking at the mechanisms and the conditioning that allow you to have your day-to-day experience in ignorance of how you're acting that out. So we have to draw together that historical narrative where the power and privilege that white people have is actually attached to our day-to-day cultural practice.
Definitely. And I'm so happy that there's so many educators on this call, because, I think we have to do what we're doing and right. And I think, I have a really hard time, and I really hope that people that are watching this don't come away from this thinking, oh, I did it, I'm done now, right? Because this might be your first step, but this is literally a continuous practice for the rest of your life. And this is a continuous learning. We've learned it, we are learning it, we are in the process of learning all the time. And I think to be educated in this is understanding that we are always learning. And we are always bringing with us exactly what we've learned. And I would love to see, an educational system that really tests people on this. I don't want you to just know that slavery happened and, hopefully that it was awful and disgusting. I mean, I think that's even a level that a lot of people in this country aren't aware of. But being tested constantly on these concepts that we're going to be talking through tonight. And if we're not going to have that in our schools, I hope people are bringing that into their families and into their personal lives as well. So I really want to talk about that discomfort that we talked about at the beginning, because we started diving into this stuff pretty deeply, and we need you to be uncomfortable. If you're not uncomfortable right now, that means that you're not challenging yourself in a way that's actually going to lead to change. You know, I get uncomfortable in these conversations. I carry with me so much privilege. I'm a man. I'm American. I'm a big guy. I get to talk to really, really powerful people in a lot of really great communities. I need to really dive deep into my own privileges and understand that I carry those with me, and I need to be conscious of them all the time. And that can be an uncomfortable growth process. Growing pains are really real, and that's what we're doing here. That's what that metaphor about this being an exercise of our muscles is all about. And right now we're focusing on white supremacy, because white supremacy has been a definer for patriarchy, for classism, for xenophobia, for homophobia in this country. It's all been guided by that base of white supremacy. And when you start understanding that, that's when I think you'll be able to understand better all of those other isms that live in our lives. Is there anything you want to add, Dr. Pitts or Dr. Brown, about discomfort?
Just to say that, go ahead, Dr. Brown.
I'm just saying no.
I was going to say, I'm living in that discomfort right now. I invited both my parents to this forum as well. So to know that this is an ongoing conversation at all levels of my family. And so if you ever want to have that conversation about how to have a discussion about race with your child, or I'm very grateful to my parents for continuing to have this conversation with me now. I would be happy to talk to you or collaborate. And so thanks, Mom and Dad, for allowing me to push back. And thank you to my colleagues who are on this phone call leaning in.
And I think that thank you is so warranted, because this is definitely, even if you don't want to bring this into your daily life for some reason, this is a skill. And your kids are going to thank you for understanding the world around them. They're going to thank you for understanding other people and the experiences that outside of their lives, because that is going to be a skill that people need in their personal lives, in their professional lives, to just walk through the world that we're creating together right now. So I think that's a very merited thank you. And the next question we want you to start thinking about as we continue to move through this night to night is, now that, every single time you feel like you've learned something new or something strokes you the wrong way, or you get that tingle down your spine, how does what I know now, how does that change the way I'm going to integrate abolitionist practices, anti-racist practices into my knowledge, into my understanding, and into my daily life? Because you have so much power in just being that co-conspirator every single day. So we're going to move on to naming and framing racism. And I know that a lot of people have a really hard time. I mean, it's really interesting because every single day as a person of color, you are exposed to disgusting words and disgusting language around who you are, and not just, slurs. But I think, even in the questions that we were asked tonight, there were so many assumptions that were based in racism. And I'm happy that people ask those questions of me, because I do not want them going to people out in the community living their regular lives and the people that we have here tonight. But, I've seen people be called out for racism or called a racist, and it seems just as bad to them in their perception as the actual racism that they've committed. And there's so much more power in being the racist than being the person that calls out the racism, unfortunately. Right? And I know we're asking all of you to call it out when you see it, to be anti-racist, but because of the way that our white supremacist systems are set up, there is violence and historical power behind the racist acts. There is not violence and historical power behind someone calling you out for racism, right? And so we're going to talk a little bit about naming and framing racism and white supremacy and why that's so important. So Dr. Pitts, you set up this slide. So do you want to kind of lead this conversation? And Dr. Brown, please jump in whenever you feel you want to.
Sure. I just want to acknowledge what you just said about the power, though. I think that's an incredibly important point. And my friend Ronald, who's a teacher in this district, he and I have talked for many years about how being called a racist, he said it's like white teachers' kryptonite. Like, kids or other adults, if you lob that racist, like you're a racist. And another friend on the call tonight, Sam Rogers, has often said to me, what if we just leaned in? Or what if we said, tell me more about that?
What if you take that as an opportunity to challenge yourself and grow? Then you'd be, if this was growing muscles, you'd be the biggest, muscliest person on the beach, right? If you just took
ripped, yeah. that kryptonite wouldn't get you anymore. And I think that's why we have to complicate the definition of racism. And so we have a couple of here. The one in yellow is a very famous one. That's one that Robin DiAngelo uses in White Fragility as well. She uses privilege plus power. Oh shoot, now I'll have to find it. I messed that up. Oh, prejudice plus power is racism, is some people's definition. David Wellman in Beverly Daniels Tatum's book, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria, calls it a system of advantage based on race. And more recently, Ibram Kendi, in his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, gives us tons of different definitions. Highly recommend it if you're looking for a place to begin. But he calls it a marriage of racist policies and racist ideas that produces and normalizes racial inequities. And that's the thing. This is not me as an individual, I'm racist, and that's the problem. It's me as an individual raised in a racist society, and that racism is the norm rather than the exception. It's become so invisible because it's all encompassing around us. And so I'll share, and we'll get into some statistics and different opportunities to break that down in our community here in Sun Prairie and in Dane County tonight.
And I think that really exposes, reminds me of one of my most hated phrases, which is reverse racism, right? And I hate it for two reasons. And it's because it inherently means that there's a correct way to be racist, and then anything that's against that is reversed somehow. It's not natural, right? There's a natural way, and we have to understand that these systems have been built. And I love seeing your book there, because I think a lot of people are going to say, wow, I have to do so much reading and so much research now. But you've learned these things. These things were not born into you. You have had the time and the pain and the work that has gone into learning how these racist systems work and feeding into them and living in them. And so when you're intimidated by all the work that's going to go into this, or when you think of racism as this inherent way, that's really not correct. This is something that this should be part of your life, and it becomes so much easier when you bring it part of your life all the time. And another reason I really hate that phrase, reverse racism, is because racism is so dependent on power. It is not, somebody can hate you because of the color of your skin. I can hate somebody because of the color of their skin, but I do not bring with me the power of an entire world, of entire Western civilization with me. Power in this world is not just you having control over your property, but it's the systems of police enforcement that also support that control of your property. It is systems of banking that support that control of your property. It's the systems of media that control that support your control of that property. It is systems of international war that control that help you control that part of your property. There's certain countries in this world, if you think at an international scale, that have atom bombs, and they're allowed to have atom bombs. And even at that level, there was white supremacy that is built into that. And so it's not possible for me to carry and actually have these effects of a racist bone that I might have in my body on other races, or I should say actually on white people. But racism, because racism is so dependent on that larger system. And I saw Dr. Pitts, you're going to add something.
I was going to say just that, Ruben, you and I talked earlier, a colleague, and I think one of the parents who may be on this call, posted some things from Dr. Tracy Benson, who I'm not familiar with her work, but a quote she had was, "It's amazing how folks can Google how to make face masks or homemade bread, but never think how to Google how to fight racial bias or be an anti-racist." And so the challenge we sort of laid down, or we're talking about briefly, is what if I committed enough time to working on being an anti-racist this summer as I did to my tan? What if I, as a white person, when I went to the pool, I took along an anti-racist book? And I'm not trying to throw any shade. Like, we deserve to enjoy our summer and to get out if we can, within the safety of COVID. I have a lot of public health nurses who are my friends and family. Please be respectful. And we have that responsibility. Like, no one has hidden this from us. We have chosen to allow it to be hidden. And I think that that's some ownership that we as white folks may need to take on to begin this healing process.
And it's important to recognize that with that example of those examples that I tried to give earlier of an average day of mine, I'm putting the work in. It's not around necessarily reading these things, but I'm putting all this energy into surviving every single day. and asking our people who want to be co-conspirators, people who want to be allies, to put that energy in is a really genuine ask, because it's happening no matter what. It's just more energy coming out of us and less energy coming out of you, right? And so really figuring out how to balance that energy. So we're going to talk about systemic racism, but Dr. Brown, I want to ask you, when you're working with people, what barriers are you seeing to people having comfort with saying this is white supremacy, this is racism?
I think probably just having the language, to develop the language is, something that comes out of practice. And so what I keep encouraging people to do is to keep practicing. We've all kind of inherited the same narrative, but we've inherited it from different perspectives. And wanting people to examine their motivation for doing this work, so that, they're not thinking about guilt or shame or blame, but they're thinking about what the costs are to them and what the costs are to larger humanity.
Yes.
And that gets us into discussions about implicit bias. And I think that's a really important discussion to have, because people do feel a lot of shame about being racist and helplessness. And in order to not let that become some moment of white fragility, there has to be also this willingness to go beyond that feeling and recognize that, we've all inherited this, and working with implicit bias so that it doesn't shut you down or make you run. That's one of the reasons why I use contemplative practices, because building that awareness, like you guys talk about flexing those muscles, building that awareness is what makes you less judgmental and have more flexibility with how you work with your own mind. And that gives you some foundation for working with implicit bias. So you do become more able to break silence and to get, and because of that, getting into the more action steps, how you engage these institutions. And I'm looking forward to this part about the systemic racism, because that foundation is what allows people to become co-conspirators in how they engage these institutions.
Yeah, I love a couple things in there. And, I grew up on campus here in Madison. So I always am very aware when language becomes this barrier for people, right? And so there's two things that I want to dive deeper into what you said. You said contemplative practices, which I would love to hear more about what that means. But I think, something I can speak to, and I would love to have you lead this too, as much as you feel comfortable talking about that, that bias that's built into us, because I think, we're going to talk a little bit more about how Wisconsin is actually one of the worst places to be a Black male in the entire country. And I think also a Black woman. I'm not sure if that's true, but it's a pretty terrible place by the numbers. And so, but we always think of this thing as Midwest nice, and we always think, I'm a good person and I'm being kind and I'm waving to people, and so how do we move to even understand how it's not about being a good, nice person. It's really how that's different from anti-racism.
I think it's really valuable to think about structural oppression when we talk about that. The reason is because what most of us are missing when we're just going about our lives in the water we swim in that has no racial narrative, and if you don't have that narrative and you actually also don't know it's missing. So there's this kind of violence that happens at the interpersonal and structural level that is actually pretty blind, which isn't to say that we can't see impacts of that violence, but we don't see the connection between not addressing and speaking truth to power as complicity and as perpetuating that violence. So there's this disconnect between the violence that the Black community faces. It is a terrible place for Black people to be. It's one of the worst places for Black people to be is in Madison. And it's also voted one of the best places for white people to be. How do those two things coexist in the same town? That's the disconnect that we're missing. And I think we miss it because that narrative of, and that practice of where we're talking about race and our implication in the structural violence of racism is not there. And I'm sorry for using all these words. But I think that as people start to read more, the texts that Dr. Pitts mentioned are very good. I love Kendi and Dr. Love. But as people begin to read these texts and they begin to like flex that muscle, it will become easier. You will develop more ease with it. And the reason I use contemplative practice, if I may, is that it's about turning your own mind into an ally. First you have to find those places that you fear most. And we have to be willing to recognize that white people are terrified about race, and they have to be, because all of their identity is constructed around it. And so you're asking people to take themselves apart, and they don't know how to do that. And there's no institutional support for doing that. So we need to put that support there so that it can happen. We're not coddling racism. We're not making it easier on oppressors. We're not doing any of that. We're recognizing that our oppressions are linked, and we have to help each other.
Yes, that co-liberation that we're trying to talk about today.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, what you were saying, points out one thing too, is that people, I think oftentimes, especially when they see examples of successful people of color and successful Black people, they say, well, if they can do it, then, the world must be good. I think that's what a lot of people said when Obama was president. If he could do it, then what's holding everybody else back? And it becomes this excuse game, and it becomes this way to ignore, like you said, the power in not doing anything, and how that's a perpetuative system.
Well, and that, I think you both spoke to incredibly important parts of the systemic system. If we were to look at this, another author who speaks about that, who came to Sun Prairie this year, please join us for the Social Justice Ed Camp this coming year, but Dr. Jamila Lescott came. She wrote Black Appetite, White Food, and she uses these 4 eyes of oppression to talk about critical literacies and how we can investigate racism at both interpersonal and institutional levels. And it's terrifying to break any one of those things down, Dr. Brown. I'm so grateful for you to say that. In my research, one of the biggest limitations I find in terms of K-12 teachers' abilities to teach Black history is that introspective processing that is required. Because once we recognize our place within this racist system, it requires a radical reimagining of who we are.
Yeah, very much so.
We have to let go of parts of our childhood, of parts of our country's narrative, the exceptionalism of Black and brown individuals, the bootstraps narrative, use all of those tenets of critical race theory to break down the systemic racism. And Ruben, can you go to the next slide? Because I think it gives some examples of each of these practices. So if you're doubting what we're saying, and you're having a moment where you're like, well, that doesn't happen to me, or I'm one of the good ones. You very well may be, but there really aren't. Because in terms of what happens to people on a racial basis, imagining white supremacy, imagining racist and oppressive practices across our society. Look at these. This is from Pew Research Foundation. So this is impacting people and communities and many different walks of life. But as you can see, white folks, we got nothing to complain about comparatively.
Yes, and I love that at the bottom it says people assumed I was racist or prejudiced. And, thinking about how that seems to be the one concern, right? So, or I guess fear for my personal safety is another one, but I think that might have racism tied up in it as well. But I think something that you mentioned, I'm actually forgetting it right now. But I think, thinking about being a teacher and teaching Black history across the world and here in the United States, and having that moment where you're like, wow, I'm part of this. I think also we have in Western culture, we have such a idea of expertise And you can't be an expert on something, I think, in that moment, it feels for people, if you are part of the problem that's perpetuated it, right? And so I think a lot of times you see people, especially white people, who are trying to talk about this stuff, try to push away that history that's connected to them, because then they need to be learning, and it must be hard as a teacher to admit you need to be learning and also be that educator in that space at the same time. So we've mentioned this already, how Wisconsin is, by the numbers, the worst place to be Black in America. And so I really want people who are watching this to think about, this is so much beyond having, a brat fest and everybody's there, right? We're thinking about how people got there and how people felt when they were there. And so in every single experience that we have as Black people, there's so much more feeding into that. And there's so much more that can determine our outcomes and determine them very negatively. And Wisconsin, actually, if you are a white person, it's actually a very upwardly mobile place. And if you are a Black person, it is one of the worst places in the country to live. And so, like Dr. Demita Brown pointed out, how is that possible? And being really, really clear about asking yourself that on a regular basis. And so, because Dr. Pitts is, works in Sun Prairie, we really want to bring that back to how this plays out in the Sun Prairie community. And I would love for you to take over this part of the conversation, Dr. Pitts.
Sure. And if you're looking for some of the receipts in terms of Wisconsin being the worst place in the nation to be Black, it's in terms of child poverty, child well-being, incarceration, and unemployment. And for 7 out of the last 10 years, we've been the most disparate in terms of academic outcomes for Black and white learners. Many of you educators on this call have heard me share that again, but it also speaks to the hidden past of our community, of our state. And so again, we'll share this slideshow at the end of tonight, but it has lots of links so that you can continue to learn if you're interested. Here in Sun Prairie, we are on Indigenous land. If we want to talk about the original sin of our nation of pushing off the Indigenous tribes who are in this community. When we look back at the history of Sun Prairie, as a former 2nd grade teacher in this community, we teach the very happy history of Augustus Byrd coming from Milwaukee to found the Capitol in Madison. And he came through days of inclement weather and the sun came up over the prairie, and it's a delightful story. But what we don't think about is who were the Native Americans who were here? Who had the power? When Charles Byrd came back 2 years later to be the first founding father, there were potentially people of color here even that early. There were enslaved peoples in the state of Wisconsin. By a couple different estimates that I found online last night, looking at the Historical Society, between 500 and 600 enslaved people of African descent in the state of Wisconsin.
And how hard was it for you to actually find those numbers? Because I think that's a lasting problem here, is that, on this YouTube channel, if anybody's interested, we did the story of a thriving Sun Prairie, really redefining Sun Prairie's history and how it's been so multicultural for so long. But it was so incredibly hard to find any written history about Black folks and Native folks in this community before, I don't think, 1970.
Yeah.
And Native folks never.
So 1870, Philip Stevenson, I found this out in reading the Historical Society's former president's narrative of the history of Sun Prairie. He was the first Black resident of Sun Prairie. He was a farmhand. So Philip Stevenson, 1870. And then in the early 1900s, there were Black viners as they're listed in the Historical Society. And I just got a newspaper for the city of Sun Prairie that the Historical Society is opening. But we as residents in Sun Prairie can go there and learn and ask to see the resources in their vaults and things. They've let me go and thumb through pictures and all sorts of things. But this narrative we have of Black and brown folks in Sun Prairie is largely missing. The narrative that we have of our Hmong population, of our Hispanic population is largely missing. And we really have the opportunity as teachers, as community members, to reframe that story together. So I put that here to just say the oppressive practices are real, even here in our community. And that as part of Dane County, as we'll soon see by some of the other demographics, The health disparities, the wellness disparities are persisting even in Sun Prairie. So please don't think that just because we live in a beautiful community, and we do, that we don't have deeply seated white supremacist and racist ideologies at the foundation of our community. And that's not to say that's your fault. It's to say that I encourage you to make the change, and to together, let's build a new way forward. We have the opportunity to refound, to reclaim our community, and to tell the stories.
That's right. Yeah, you know, thank you so much, Dr. Pitts. I so appreciate you unearthing these documents and just access places where we can access the documents. I also just wanted to add one study that I've been using in the CLIP Labs is the Race in the Heartland report that came out in October, was created by the Policy Institute at the University of Iowa, and it compares all of the Midwestern states, and it uses this term called hypersegregation, but it does go back to the migrations out of the South in the 50s to look at how some of the first policies were put in place to ensure that hypersegregation. So we're dealing with, you know, at least 50 years of policymaking that ensured that. So it wasn't an accident. It was very much a systematic effort.
Definitely.
And I can share that report with folks if you haven't seen it.
Yeah, we can definitely add that. Like Dr. Pitt said, we're going to be sharing this out afterwards, so I'd love to add that to this. And, you know, I think something that we tend to do a lot in research is we devalue the history and education systems of non-white communities, right? This information might be held in oral histories in these communities. And we know that there's so much power connected to having data and numbers in our American culture. And so I really, you know, I want to respect that there are different ways of understanding this history. And we know that money and power is held with white ways of being in our community. So thank you for bringing that back to our own community. And Dr. Brown, you didn't grow up in Wisconsin, correct?
No, I grew up in Iowa.
Okay. Does it feel similar coming here, or is it different with understanding the history in that way?
I think it's very similar. I spent most of my adult life on the West Coast, so it's an interesting point of comparison. But yes, Iowa and Wisconsin have a lot in common. I know before I moved here, I was just reading horror stories about Scott Walker, and that Walkerism is overcoming Iowa now. So he's come and gone here, but that trend is not limited to Wisconsin. It's a Midwestern phenomenon. And so actually, dare I say, national phenomenon, because that I think we're in a very severe white lash moment in which we're looking at some of the outcome of what I would say are some steps forward in the presidency of Barack Obama, but also some steps forward in the larger movement for social justice, because the terms that we're able to use today, this very forum, came about because of some of the really important grassroots and academic work that created the capacity for us to have these conversations. So we are looking at a backlash, but I do believe that that foundation has been laid. And I really still believe, in spite of all of the worst appearances that we're looking at right now, that the crystallization of that resistance by the more traditional elements that want to go back is really a response to the success we've been having.
That's a great way to look at it. I want to point out something that you said in talking about Walkerism. And, you know, as a city employee, I'm bipartisan. And I think, you know, it's interesting thinking about the way I grew up and how growing up, I feel like it felt very different along political lines, that it didn't define how you thought of other people as human beings. And maybe that was just my youth, and maybe that was a myth that I was living in. But I think I want to encourage people that no matter how you identify politically, you can be part of this work, and you can help the people that you live with and the community that you live in to be anti-racist, to be abolitionist. Because if you truly believe that the way you want this country to work is to have everybody be part of it, then it is so important to still be part of this work.
That's too true. I so appreciate you reiterating that point, because we don't want political partners, you know the word,
Partisanship.
polarization. I'll use the word polarization.
Yes. Yeah, we don't want that, and I don't want to isolate or give power to it by, saying these are aligned. This is not, you see racism and white supremacy in the Democratic Party. You see racism and white supremacy in the Republican Party, because it's made up of people. It's made up of these systems that we live in. And so, I just really want to recognize that.
And speaking of systems, this slide, just briefly before we jump into some of the other questions, and many of these slides, ladies and gentlemen, too, to confer, like these were dealing with some of the questions that we received as well. So we were trying to give an overview and then answer explicit questions as well. But to just acknowledge that racism is covert and overt, and that so is white supremacy, and that these things are so ingrained within who we are and who we've become. Here are some recent examples. Most of these are from the state of Wisconsin. That KKK spray paint on a Black Lives Matter sign was posted by one of my colleagues on the east side of Madison. That happened yesterday. The nooses and the pictures of a number of deceased African Americans were posted in a park in Milwaukee just this weekend. This AVID certificate, Snopes, I looked it up on Snopes. This young woman received most likely to blend in with white people as an award for the year from her teacher, and that we would think that that would be okay.
I feel so bad for that child who has to live with that.
Well, and that's what the teacher felt worth recognizing. So the challenge to us white folks is, regardless of what you believe, this is a human rights issue. This is a call to action, a call for us to undo systems that harm our children in schools, in policies, in parks, in neighborhoods where they have to see this overt racism in their face all the time. So
thank you for bringing that so close to home, because we try to put blinders on and pretend like it's not part of our communities, and this is within the last few days. So I think that's really important to talk about. And so thinking about that, what is transition into thinking about some of the questions that we got from community members. And so I really appreciate people being honest in the questions that they were asking, because in that honesty we're seeing how racism is built and ingrained so deeply in our understanding of each other and in the world and of the world, that it started, the answers to some of our questions start so far before the question, that it'll be interesting to have this conversation together. So one of our first questions was talking about sports and Black folks, and especially Black young men in sports, and why that's often seen as a pathway for success, especially when a lot of sports teams are owned by old white rich men in the United States, and I don't think it's necessarily going toward their money. Those billions of dollars aren't going towards the NAACP or Colin Kaepernick's work. And we recently saw that football has decided to recognize Colin Kaepernick at a national level, and I think again that's why going back to that tree planting analogy, it's it's so important to, if you haven't already, jump on this moment, because you have so many people with you right now at so many different levels. It's really like I think Dr. Brown was saying. So this whiplash and this white lash that we're seeing is in response to these amazing strides that are happening right now. So I wanted to go into this first question. And I know Dr. Pitts and I have had some time to prepare answers. I don't know, Dr. Brown, if you were able to see all the questions beforehand. Oh, yes, you were. But
Yes, that was.
Yeah, but I think just giving my own perspective, thinking about how, yes, that may be the reality, but I think Dr. Pitts is actually going to show a really great graphic about, if you're going to say that Black people can't participate in white-owned spaces, where do we go? Because essentially at the end of the day, that ends up being every part of America, right? And I think Dr. Brown has talked about creating those Black-owned spaces, and we've had examples of Black-owned spaces in this country that have been destroyed by white supremacy over and over again. And, you know, also thinking about where are our youth of color rewarded, right? I mean, we just saw that disgusting example of this young, I'm assuming African-American girl, be rewarded for some perception that the way she was acting was okay with whiteness. And so if we're not rewarding students outside of sports, why are we expecting them to feel connected to anything outside of sports? I know that our own school system has so many deeply ingrained problems with over punitive systems in our school systems for students of color, and that lack of support for them in really genuine ways. And so I really challenge you, the person who asked this question, to ask yourself, what am I doing to make other pathways for success open, genuine, not tokenizing for Black youth?
Ruben, if you don't mind going to the next slide too, I want to promote that sports are a platform for liberation and access that we otherwise deny in the United States. I can use some personal and systemic examples, but think about the sports heroes who we see. We don't hear often the stories of resistance, of power, of privilege, of access that our Black and Brown community members are given within sport. And I'll use an example of my father, who was a Badger at UW for many years, and speaks about this loving community that he and his fellow teammates, who were, many of whom were Black in the 70s, and what they were able to create. It allowed them access to the college and community, incredible opportunities in terms of platforms for protest and policy, and also being in front of their community and showing what they could do. Like, why would we take away that opportunity from folks of color? And the next slide is the one that you suggested. This is from Dr. D'Angelo's talk when she did come to Madison. And this is a screen capture of one of her slides. So I do have her little @Robin D'Angelo at the bottom. But these are all organizations and different outlets that are predominantly run by white folks. And if we look at the Sun Prairie schools, over 90% of us are white. So we have a lot of work to do. And if we're potentially saying that Black and Brown children should look beyond white-run spaces, as Ruben said, we have a long way to go. How can we create other loving communities within these other systems to allow for the full humanity of our colleagues, of our students, of our friends, to really be present? So,
Dr. Brown, I know you were uniquely interested in this question. Is there anything that you wanted to bring forward for around sports?
Yeah, just a few things. I really love the idea of questioning ownership itself, particularly because we can't separate white supremacist culture from how capitalism developed. And this whole idea of ownership, you know, players are traded. So are slaves. So are slaves. You know, and so we have some of the overlay of that white supremacist culture within the sports arena as well. So on that level, I think we need to challenge the idea of ownership and look more into what kinds of models we want to replace that with. I know there's been some talk of, among Black athletes about starting in another league where they are calling the shots.
Yes.
Whatever happens, I want to see more cooperative approaches to ownership, where a community owns something and the benefits go to the community. Cooperative frameworks bring us out of such stark economic disparities. We're looking at the 1% and the 99% and how that has gotten worse over the last 20 years or so, and what impact that has on a democratic society. Some really great writing about that. Obviously, Noam Chomsky has talked about it a lot. Richard Wolff talks about cooperative development. I think that's something that we need to think more about, because especially within the Black community, I would love to see that kind of investment in how we change the economic situation in Black communities. So the whole idea of ownership within a capitalist context needs to be interrogated. The other thing is that Black people, I don't care what you give us. We're going to take it and make it something workable.
Yes.
We make something out of nothing. Before Blacks were the primary athletes in the NBA, it was Jewish people, right? But now it's Black people. But the reality is that whether you give us white Jesus or the white ownership of the NBA or a white government, we're going to take it and we're going to make it workable some way. So, and that's what I see our athletes doing. Whether their voices are acknowledged or not, historically they've done this. They've spoken out. They've given money to Black colleges and other Black issues and initiatives. So I don't really think that that's so much an obstacle. I think that, like so many other things, we find ways to make it ours and to expand its cultural significance. Hip hop culture and the sports arena are so closely interwoven, and how Black kids express themselves and how they find cultural models. That's such it's more complex than it looks. There's a lot of consciousness there as well. And so I think we need to validate that as well while we're looking at sports. Are we just are we only encouraging people to be involved in sports? I don't think so. But like anything else, we take what's there and we make it the best we can make it.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you. Yeah, I think that's definitely all true. And so I'm looking at the time because that's part of my job. And we're already at 7:17. We have a good amount to go. I want to check in with you, Dr. Pitts and Dr. Brown. Would you be okay with pushing back to 7:45? And if not, that's completely okay. I just want to make sure that I am being aware of our time.
I'm good to stay.
And Dr. Brown, you can let me know via email or on this call.
No, that's fine. That's fine.
Oh,
yeah.
Okay, great. So thank you everybody for being here with us. So one of our next questions is, why would a mixed race person identify as Black if white privilege is real? So there's so much that went into this question, right? If white privilege is real, and we've talked a lot about that today, so maybe you're in a different spot right now. And so we all got to share our answers with each other before this conversation. And mine was really a stream of consciousness, bringing in a lot of great reading that I've gotten to do and great videos that I got to see. And one piece of that was the one drop rule. But Dr. Brown, you educated me on that a little bit, talking about when it was actually institutionalized. So I wondered if you want to talk about that or give your answer first.
Sure. I mean, I will just be brief. The Supreme Court decision in 1967 reversed that in Virginia versus Loving. That was the case about miscegenation. Mm-hmm. But in addition to ruling on that, they ruled on the one drop rule in 67. So that's when that actually went out of, there's no legal basis for it, although, of course, informally, there's still that practice and that understanding of it.
Yes.
We're still operating under the influence of it.
Exactly. And for anybody who's not sure what that is, during slavery and Jim Crow era, it was an explanation for who was Black and who was white. Early on in the United States, you could only be American if you're white or if you're Black. Other races weren't really included in that. And so there was a real effort of people to define themselves as either white or Black. And most people who emigrated here, of course, wanted to choose white because that came with a lot more privileges. But the one drop rule was saying any traceable ancestry of anybody Black in your bloodline meant that you were Black. And so I think you can see a lot of great examples of this, in storytelling, in television, in movies, about how, as a mixed race person, especially if it's between Black and white, you are the non-white race because whiteness was kept as on this pedestal of being of this false purity that I think we sometimes assume of people. And so, there's a great movie, Imitation of Life, that has really stood with me for my entire life about, and I don't think she was a mixed race person, but she might have been, and I haven't watched this in a long time, but it was in the 1950s and she was white passing. and thinking about how painful that was for her to marry into this white family because she was white passing. And at one point, her mother, who is dark skinned, comes to visit, and they can't act like they're related. And so if you're thinking about, all of that goes into a mixed race person's identity, they come with that. They come with this history of not denying your Blackness. It comes with this history of who is Black in this country. It comes with this history of who is American in this country. And so to say that if you choose to identify with your Blackness, that white privilege isn't real, that's a falsehood in itself. And we know that whiteness is a construct, it's a social construct. So people aren't going up to you and testing your blood and saying you're white or you're Black. We're really basing it all off what we see, right? And so you can have people who identify as Black who are white passing, and they're not purposefully doing that. But in these situations that I talked about, going through their homes, driving their car, they may not have those experiences of that, or that anxiety of I'm being judged based on the color of my skin, because people are assuming that whiteness. And so really understanding that race is a lot more. I mean, if you watch some great documentaries, it talks about the color of our skin and our bone structure are so separately so disconnected that our race based on those things wildly varies. People that you would think have similar bone structures based on the color of their skin don't at all, and vice versa. And so thinking about, you're absorbing the world through your eyes. But if you only saw people's faces through your hands and felt their bone structure, that might be an entirely different way that you absorb this information. And so those are just some of the things that I want to talk about. Dr. Pitts?
Thank you both for your perspective and experience. And certainly this is a nuanced answer, and people's identity is so personal and wrapped up in who they are and their family's culture as well. I want to acknowledge that there's power in Black history, and there's power in Black folks and the ways in which they built this country. And to deny the important and powerful heritage that really we all stand on today, also, I can see why folks wouldn't want to do that, despite the challenges of a white supremacist society. And I would point to W.B. Du Bois, who in 1903, in his Souls of Black Folk, talked about the acknowledgement that a person of color has, and Du Bois was mixed race himself, that as a man, he was able to see himself as both a Black man and as an American, and that those were potentially two very separate things because of the veil that we white folk often put upon Black folks and multiracial individuals and all sorts of things. And that's part of that white privilege. So what I can speak to is the white privilege. And I would contest that for white folks, that two-ness is not something that we have ever been raised to see. I see myself as white is right? Like the white is so invisible to us because it's been a privilege so long that we can't understand the experience of people who have a different background than we do. And so I would love to unpack that at some point, and happy to talk to any of my colleagues about it, because as Ruben and Dr. Brown have said, this is an ongoing process. So I encourage my white colleagues and friends to interrogate our own whiteness. You can do that through a white privilege survey. You can do that through Harvard's implicit bias tests, where they give you pictures and you tap your keyboard, and then they give you a rating to see if you're biased. So check yourself and some of the assumptions that might come with white privilege and color. Sorry.
No, please, thank you. It would be great if we could have a whole nother hour and a half for each of these questions. So let's plan on that, and let's keep going, everybody. So one of the next questions that we got was really, deeply came from a lot of assumptions around the Black community. And Dr. Pitts was helpful enough to reach out to a colleague of hers and think about Black health in our community. That's one of the deepest disparities. And think about how Black women especially are treated so differently in our healthcare system, and how that's actually led to, pre-Jim Crow disparities in health, and especially maternal health, between Black women and white women.
Absolutely. So Ruben just pulled up the 10 critical and consistent themes. This is from the Saving Our Babies, which is put out by Black Women's Wellness in Dane County, or it's listed on their website. And I encourage us to take a look at these bullet points. When we look at these consistencies in, when we talked about those 4 pieces of institutionalized and interpersonal racism, and we think about these are the most consistent themes that Black women raised in terms of speaking about their own health and wellness. How many of these things are connected to institutional and interpersonal racism? And that stress that Ruben, you spoke of, that stress that Dr. Brown spoke of, to really allow us to interrogate how many of these practices we allow to go unseen as white people in this community. And the next slide was even more troubling to me, which is, this is on healthydane.org. And this was shown to me by a doctor friend and a public health nurse. And thank you guys for reaching out on my behalf. But this is a demographic dashboard. So everything that's there in green and black and blue is directly from that healthydane.org website. These are Dane County and statewide statistics. So I added the state in red underneath. But this is overall health and well-being. Take a look at the white population's overall health and well-being. Almost 85%. And then take a look at the population of African Americans in Dane County. 5.5%. We are worse in Dane County than we are in the state as a whole. And if you look at that 0.5%, so certainly I have more reading to do on this topic myself, but I wanted to lift up these disparities because that question came, was pretty shocking around women's rights and health in the Black community in particular. And so I think we have one more slide on this, but I'd be interested in Dr. Brown's thinking as well. So this last slide, I just want to direct people to the data show inequities. This is also from Dane County Public Health. And this website, again, I'll put in the links, but this last one is from a presentation they gave this year. And the only 3 things that don't show inequities in Dane County, if you'll look, is the availability of culturally appropriate healthcare, access, older adults living alone, and then lastly, the number of high ozone days. Everything else in Dane County is a disparate inequity in terms of especially our African American population. And so this is systemic racism, is basically the point.
And, one thing that, when I was reading through the original question, which I'm not going to share, but, there's so many myths that went into the wording of the question. One of the myths that went into it was this idea of a Black mother with lots of children and no support. And, that comes from this idea of a welfare queen that was created during the Reagan era to kind of justify the country not putting money into social programs. But we know that by the numbers in this country, more white people are using those welfare programs. But we know also that defining it as a Black issue makes it so that it loses its popularity and loses its power. And so really think about when things are framed for you around, certain people use this, what is that message trying to send to you? Because oftentimes they're inaccurate. Oftentimes they create these perpetuating myths, and they're very dangerous and end up with things like this, where we see really tangible differences and outcomes for people. Dr. Brown, I would love to hear, if you've been able to work in the health space at all.
Yeah, absolutely. So one thing I want to point out before getting into the specifics about health is that when we're looking at these disparities, I think it's tremendously important for white people to depersonalize it. We are talking about institutional oppression. We're talking about structural violence. So structural violence is where the needs of marginalized communities are systematically not met because of institutionalized racism. So healthcare is one of those examples. And why I say depersonalize it is because it is an institutional practice that, because we're not challenging it, we're perpetuating. So that's where our individual responsibility comes in. And I say this because I don't want people to be overwhelmed by the weight of the cost to human life. You know, it's easy to kind of look at these disparities and go, I'm pretty sure I didn't do that. And so depersonalize that and look at the institution itself. And then we're much more empowered to think about how we can interrupt those practices. Okay? Even if it's like, sometimes when I go to the doctor, I want a white friend to come with me to advocate for me, to look at how I'm being treated. And so that while I can focus on my health, my ally or my co-conspirator can focus on advocating within that system for me. So, you know, that's something that you can do right now today, you know. And I know that because of segregation, a lot of white people don't even know Black people, you know, like a lot of, like, even when I was living on the West Coast, I would ask my white friends, you know, how many Black friends do you have? And they would just count me. And I'm like, go out of your way to break down that barrier, because segregation drives these statistics. It protects our ignorance, and it keeps a low visibility on the harm that is being caused. So we want to make sure that visibility is heightened. And as white people, using your privilege to heighten that visibility is one of the most important things you can do. You know, and so go out of your way to get to know what's happening in the Black community and finding out how you can be a co-conspirator to disrupt some of these practices and some of this institutionalized oppression. So, and that depersonalizes it. You know, it's not about, you know, the performativity of it. You know, it's about, I care, my humanity is at stake if I do nothing. Because every time you stay silent and every time you do nothing, your humanity is chipped away at a little bit more. And so that cost is for all of us. It's much higher cost for the Black community, Black and brown communities. If you look at Native communities, you know, if you look at diabetes, you look at hypertension, you look at strokes and heart disease, you look at all of these things and how they're exacerbated in Black and brown communities. You know, that is intergenerational systematic oppression within the healthcare system. Don't be overwhelmed by it. Think about how you can become a co-conspirator and interrupt it.
Thank you. That was amazing.
That
and
was
as
amazing.
Dr. Pitts pointed out, that was a great transition into our next question about how do you approach allyship? How do you know if words and actions are affecting a person of color? So because you seem so excited about it, Dr. Pitts, would you want to start that?
I just wanted to also honor Dr. Brown and say how sorry I am that our society is at a point where you would need to ask a friend to go with you to the doctor. And I am very hopeful that we can all work together to continue to interrogate these systems. So,
yeah. And it's interesting that you said those words because, you know, and bring that back to what Dr. Brown was saying about, you know, be intentional about making relationships with Black folks. Also be intentional about doing it in a very human way and not coming up to people and saying, I've heard recently about all the horrible things that are happening to you, and now I'm going to fall on the sword and be this savior, because really that's not exactly what we're talking about today. Is people want to feel human, and when you make us into statistics or a sob story for you to be this savior, it really isn't what we're asking for at the end of the day.
Yeah, and if I could just add to that very briefly, you know, I think the lion's share of white people's work is in their spheres of influence, and making sure that, you know, the institutions that they operate in on a day-to-day basis aren't able to ignore the things we're talking about tonight. That's the lion's share of the work. And if you're not ready, like Ruben was saying, you know, if you're not ready to approach this in a way because you haven't done enough of that foundational work, don't rush it. You know, don't rush it. Surround yourself with other anti-racists and immerse yourself in that environment first. And make sure that you have an ongoing commitment to learning what you need to know to show up the way you want to show up. It's not okay to do that in a way that you're not prepared for. You know, it's not okay. I encourage people in my labs to make mistakes, but I want them to make those mistakes within that environment where other white people are looking at them and they're kind of giving each other the feedback they need to hear from each other about what they're doing and how they're engaging this work. And then you have to figure out when you're ready, but do that part first, that foundational work first.
Definitely.
I'm super grateful for that. And the graphic down below that says comfort in, dump out is from an article I found particularly instructive that, again, we'll link in the notes tonight. But it was basically, that is the sphere of influence, if you will. And if you were to center at this moment our Black community and folks who are really in crisis right now, and I would put racism as a significant crisis, right? We talk about COVID and the impacts on our Black community in Wisconsin. Again, we're third in the nation in terms of most disparate outcomes for people of color. But racism, I've heard lots of people say this week, you can't be inoculated, right, against racism. This is an ongoing battle. And much of that work has to be done in ourselves first and with other white folks first. So I encourage you to use this system of dump in versus dump out. And that's very not gracious conversation, but basically those people in the middle of the center need your comfort, need your companionship, need your support. They don't need you to bring them these statistics and horror stories and your pain of becoming an ally, because it's gonna hurt. Go find somebody who's outside of that circle, who's another white friend or ally or family member who you feel like you can call, and call that person and talk to them first. And educate yourself. There's tons of stuff online, you guys. I mean, you could spend the rest of the summer reading things that are on Facebook this week. Like, we have work to do, and it's our responsibility to do it first. So thank you guys for sharing this forum with me tonight and allowing me to share it.
Yes. So we are at 7:38. So I really want to make sure that we do get to the part that Dr. Brown wants to share with us with the campaign to end violence against Black people in the community. And like we said, we're going to share out these slides. So, thinking about what names are, word to use for people when you're referring to them or talking to them, which, the only thing I can say is just treat them like you would anybody else and ask them and correct yourself. And I think this is all about that learning and that growth. When you thinking about not seeing racism, I think we got to talk about that a little bit. How does anti-racist activism align with intersectional identities? And I would love to hop into that. But I think, this is all going to be a painful, discomforting conversation, and it's going to need to continue. And having that discomfort is so important. And so, thinking about this reflection tool, what, so what, now what? So what have we done is we really dove into how this works all the time in our lives, how it's affecting all of us, and what we can do to battle it. So now what is a so what? So what is, now that you're aware, there really is no excuse for you not to be doing this anti-racist work all the time. And now what? And what I want to dive into is some examples of how you can be part of this work in our own community. And one of the first ones is the campaign to end violence against Black people, which Dr. Damina Brown is a leader in. And I'm not sure if you are the leader or one of many leaders. And this is the list of demands. And so I'm going to have you kind of talk us through this, through these demands, but I'd love to hear an overview of what the campaign is. And then also, I really love to dive in, especially to our first question, because I think this is a question going around, and we have an educator here, and we have a lot of educators on the line about taking police out of schools. Because even in the community, when I've had conversations with people, that's not always been a Black and white issue for people. It's not always been along race lines, yes or no. And so thinking about the perspective that's coming from, and then please just walking us through the campaign as a whole.
Sure, I'll be happy to. So in December, there was a 14-year-old Black kid who got arrested at gunpoint at his school. And, the police were called in to handle a situation that really, when you're talking about dealing with a child, you really shouldn't treat children that way. And no child should be faced with that kind of violence. So I reached out to some of the organizations that are already doing some of this work, like Freedom Inc., and they decided to partner with us in doing the task force to end violence against Black people. And so the demands came out of that, but it's very much about removing the punitive model for dealing with whatever kinds of perceived harm that we're looking at, and replacing it with abolitionist restorative justice. And what that means is that we recognize that the punitive models only create more harm, whereas the restorative justice practices give us the capacity to heal. And if we want to be in a kind of society where our basic human dignity is respected, so if we want that, we have to look at how we rehumanize each other, how we rehumanize ourselves. And so the campaign is about breaking the silence that permits this violence to be perpetuated. And in that act, we are rehumanizing ourselves and each other. So the demands are very much around getting rid of punitive policies, like you can see in number 1, remove harmful punitive policies, practices, and people, the police, from school environments, including police suspension and expulsion. We see the impact of suspension and expulsion on graduation rates, and as well as the impact on the school to prison pipeline. So we need to get rid of those kinds of influences in the educational environment. 2, we want public institutions to encourage 360-degree accountability through abolitionist restorative justice. And what that means is restorative justice isn't the situation in which you have a kid who a teacher felt like they couldn't control, and so they felt like they needed to invoke the BEP or the behavioral education plan, and where there's these graduated actions that lead to their suspension or expulsion or what have you. But instead of that, we're looking at how what Bettina Love calls the educational survival complex is really in operation there. And so there's a proactive piece that needs to be done in looking at how the institutions have created push-out patterns for Black youth in the educational environment. And that hostility, that white rage, that institutional oppression exists in all of our public schools. We have to be looking at that proactively. So that's 360-degree accountability. Number 3, support and fund a Black-led committee with decision-making and implementation power to remedy the deep patterns of harm caused by racist violence in all of its forms. So, I mean, and that's kind of like lending itself to what I just spoke about in number 1 and 2. But basically, we need to look at the autonomy and the self-determination of the Black community to best understand what the Black community needs. And so a restorative practice is to create this committee, fund and support it, so that that actual engagement in that conversation and the development of those practices can come out of the Black community. Number 4, using recommendations of that committee to invest in a campaign that decriminalizes and humanizes Black people. We've been talking about this all night. The criminalization of Black culture, Black people, Black youth has led to mass incarceration, has led to these racial disparities that we're looking at with whether it's education, healthcare, the legal system, what have you. We want to correct those disparities. We want to eliminate those disparities. We need to trust that that is going to involve a major campaign to stop criminalizing us, you know. And number 5, provide reparations to that committee so that the kinds of initiatives that we need around what our kids need in the educational environment can actually be taken seriously. Again, that needs to be led by the Black community. Number 6, provide reparations for Black land trusts and other remedies for gentrification and hypersegregation. So we know that segregation drives violence against Black people. One of the ways it does this is by making it invisible, the kinds of hypersegregation, brutalization, death at the hands of the police, all kinds of violence that we experience kept out of the public eye. So we don't see it. It's not happening. George Floyd was murdered, but in the last few weeks since George Floyd was murdered, several other Black people were murdered as well. And beyond that, 75 people were murdered by police within these last few weeks. So that was power run amok. That's violence run amok. And that's the old system, the old narrative that we're trying to get rid of. We need to replace that narrative with one that people's human needs become the priority. And then create a truth and reconciliation process to replace punitive criminal justice system with abolitionist restorative practices. So take that money out of defund the police, put that money into healthcare, put that money into education, and put it into the hands of people who are most impacted. And then 8, adopt the demands developed by the Movement for Black Lives. So right now, within the context of the COVID response, it's taking money out of police, free them all, because of the disproportionate rate of incarceration for Black people. For many of us, that turns into a death sentence within the context of COVID. If you're in jail for some petty thing and you can't afford the bail to get out, and so you should not die for that reason. So they should be released, and especially children. I can't think of any context in which children should be incarcerated. None. But the call by the Movement for Black Lives is free them all, because we know that this system is corrupt. We know that people are making money off of privatization of prisons. We know this. And Dr. Love will tell you in her book that they're doing the same thing, trying to privatize education and use the illusion of our inferiority or our inability to compete as a pretext for saying we need to privatize public education. And they're selling us this stuff, which really isn't about caring about what our youth are learning at all. And I'm talking about all youth. They're not caring about what our youth are learning at all. They're just trying to find ways to make money off of it. So we have to get that element out of education. And another thing in the Movement for Black Lives is making sure that, people are responding, like people are being allies and people are standing up and supporting the leadership that is coming out of the Black community around how to handle these problems with violence and police in the schools and what have you. So if there are questions about those, I don't think you're taking questions right now, but that's the demands in a nutshell. And yeah, do you guys have any questions?
Well, if somebody was interested in being part of that letter writing campaign, how would they do it?
Yes, every other Thursday we have a session where we go through the whole toolkit. We show you some templates about how to do your own letters. We show you some sample letters that people on the planning committee have written. We give you a directory of places to send your letters, community organizations, elected officials in the school administration, whether or the county supervisors, the mayor, the police department, state representatives. So there's a whole directory that you can use. And we talk about all of the questions that people have around why we decided on these demands and the context for doing this campaign itself.
And when you say we, do you mean the Time Bank?
I'm sorry?
When you say we, what is the name of the organization?
It's the Time Bank, and specifically the Transformative Action Network is leading this work. So the next session is July 2nd from 7 to 9:30. And you can go to our website and go on to the calendar, and you'll see on July 2nd that, where you can just click on that link and register to do a letter writing session.
And so thank you so much. I think we actually have some other information about the Time Bank right here. And I just want to be aware of the time. We're at 7:50. We went over our overtime, but I think this is such an important conversation. And, I'm getting messages from the community members that say, they want to be part of this conversation too. And so definitely, I really wanted to focus on our expertise that we have in the room tonight, but definitely being aware that this is a conversation we need to have out in our communities and with people.
And that's, Ruben, if I can add on, some of these opportunities, as we share these slides, you'll be able to click on links and see more. But one opportunity through the Sun Prairie School District that I do want to highlight is I want to thank our alders. I want to thank our superintendent, our school board for standing up and standing out and saying that Black Lives Matter and Black Lives Matter in Sun Prairie and in our schools. And they are encouraging our colleagues and teachers, staff members, everyone who works in the district to participate in these weekly listening sessions. So tonight, many of the teachers who logged in, this is their 4th or 5th session where they've come together to listen to the voices of Black and Brown community members, and tonight to me as well. But to listen, to take action, not to just sit, but to make it part of this abolitionist system that we can build together. And so I encourage those of you who are teachers, who are staff members, who are community members who wish to share your voice and are looking for other platforms, to please connect with Ruben and myself and Dr. Brown and let us know so that we can help lift your voice as well.
I won't volunteer Dr. Brown, but I'll volunteer.
Oh, sorry.
I want to make sure.
I apologize, Dr. Brown. Maybe they can come to your letter writing campaign and learn from you first. And then certainly, I apologize.
They can come to the letter campaign, but they can also join the Transformative Action Network. They can become a member of that network and also join a Cliff Lab. Because for me, the most important part, it isn't where you are, is that you commit to ongoing struggle, that you commit to making sure that you're showing up on a day-to-day basis. So it's not about where you are, or if you have things that you don't understand, or you have some uncertainty about how to proceed. None of that is as important as you making that commitment to say, I'm not going to give up on this.
Mm-hmm. Yes, there's so many places for your voice to be heard and to be in community and in conversation, in dialogue, and doing this in real time and working on that systemic racism in that long term. So I'm going to end us here. Thank you so much, Dr. Brown. Thank you so much, Dr. Pitts, for being here. And thank you everybody in our audience tonight and thank you everybody who stayed and everybody who couldn't stay. This has been an amazing, another first step for a lot of people in our community, another next step for a lot of people who've been doing this work already. And I think the great thing about, doing everything virtual is that you can come back to this. You can think about this again, because this, like we said, there's a lot of discomfort in diving into the way that our system works. And sometimes we need to absorb a little bit, come back, absorb a little bit and come back. So I encourage you all to do that and to do your own exploration. So thank you, everybody. Have a great night.
Thank you so much. Thank you
So much, guys. Good night.
Good night.
So let me end our thing.
Thank you, Ruben.
Wait, yeah, I will. Okay, so I'm no longer.
And I apologize. I'm not trying